Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this plenary session 5 on universities and democracy under the overarching theme of the conference, which is Engage University. I'm the chair of this session, and I'm delighted to welcome you and our 3 speakers who will be presenting on this session. We have sort of negotiated with the speakers that will allow some few minutes towards the end of their presentation, wherein we will spare time for 5 minutes or so for questions and answer. And this is what we intend to do. The topic for this session, universities and democracy, is very topical, given the challenges confronting our universities and our society at large. And this is here also at home and all elsewhere in the world. So the trend seems to be similar. And as alluded to yesterday by the minister in his keynote address, he mentioned the following, and I quote him, that universities should become catalysts for creating inclusive societies. And that's a mouthful. And that's what I think, in our view, the role that universities has to play in ensuring that we deepen and enforce democracy, as it were. I'm certain that we are going to have a lively session. And please use the chat box to register any questions that you have for the speakers. And then we'll make sure that if there are any questions, we'll have time to really interact with those questions at the end of the session. Now, the first speaker for the session that I'm going to now introduce is Professor Odora Hoppers. Professor Hoppers is a scholar and a policy specialist in international development, education, North-South questions, disarmament, peace and human security. She is also a UNESCO expert in basic education, lifelong learning, information systems, and science and society. Professor Hoppers was awarded a Professor Extraordinarius by the University of South Africa. She also held a DST NRF South African Research Chair in Development Education at the University of South Africa. Without much further ado, allow me to hand over to Professor Odora Hoppers. Over to you, ma'am.
I feel welcome to this session. Let me start my presentation at once. Okay, part 1, democracy and its goals. In his article, The Complexity of Simplicity, he says that it is simple procedures, codes, and programs that often yield the most complex results. In other words, complexity resides in precisely the simple programs that created it. It draws attention to ambiguities in the existing application of these concepts and indeterminacy of these applications, and enables us to acknowledge the existence of competing, distinct, but equally valid meanings. Democracy can be thought of as a concept, as a system of government with four key elements: a political system for choosing and replacing government through free and fair elections, of course; the active participation of a people; and protection of the human rights of all citizens; a rule of law in which the laws and procedures apply equally to all citizens. Democracy is a key means by people choose their leaders and hold them accountable for both their policies and their conduct while in office. It enables citizens to choose between competing parties in regular free elections. The central idea of democracy is that it is the aspirations that government is based on the consent of people who are governed. Sovereignty of the people is a precondition. So these registers follow us wherever we pronounce democracy, citizen, participation, choice, and so on and so forth. It is clear that the pillar in thinking about democracy is the citizen, with the process being played out in a nation state. But the non-citizen's presence is not a factor. Neither is democracy clear about events outside of the nation state, beyond the familiar and the community. It does not have propositions as to how citizens should relate to one another outside of the electoral processes or in the private spheres of the lived world. As Sackwell has so well put, communities as a form of group identity are not made from the abstractions of shared beliefs, but on something much more difficult to articulate, a deep level of communication, which he says it is emitting noise in the right shape. To the extent that conceptions of community miss the crucial formative role of exclusion, they misconstrue how and why the exclusions form and perpetrate themselves while remaining quite unequipped to deal with this darker shadow. In other words, the inbuilt exclusion inherent in the DNA. Communities are formed by exclusions and by violence. And what constitutes normal is articulated by a process of scapegoating. For example, creating and internalizing the hallucinatory images that degrade the other and excuses to dominate, abuse, murder, or exploit people, while exalting the we group. Thus, exclusion is key in defining an identity in a community. In other words, democracy does not equip the citizens with tools to reconstruct itself from an exclusion-based identity to one that is embracing. So democratic deficits can occur when democracy is narrowed down to elections as the arbiter of political succession, when formal equality does not say much about the social, cultural, economic structure in which this equality is embedded, when running for office at any level of government become a very expensive affair, which ends up leaving the masses with a narrow pool of people, elite of means, to choose from, legitimizing perfectly the social and economic status quo. And then when the popular sector challenge is repressed and the policies are blocked. What about human rights? In the attempt to find tools to help us to manage diversity, the human rights framework has emerged as an overarching instrument of choice in international and national discourse across the world. It implies that there is a collective commitment based on the vision of humanity and the solidarity required in order to fulfill the vision of a better life for all. The value addition element in the human rights approach is the introduction of the moral dimension of agency, responsibility, and accountability. But like democracy, tolerance, and globalization, the human rights discourse needs some critical attentions as well. I go to Howard Richards' analysis. To begin with, he acknowledges that the rights is an especially valuable concept because it is a concept that almost everybody respects as having moral authority. It makes an inward appeal to conscience, especially in the respect that most people develop inwardly to guide their own conduct and avoid infringing on other people's rights. It has moral authority in the sense that it is one is considered justified while acting within one's right, and also in the sense that one is considered to be justified in becoming indignant when one's rights are violated. But according to Richards, what we need is something more than respect for the rights of others for three reasons. Firstly, citing Hegel, Richards argued that there are too many rights actually, and where there is a surplus of right, force decides. Commonly in a war or in a barroom brawl, both sides can paint with the language of rights to give their cause the color of moral superiority and give themselves the color of knights errant fighting for a righteous cause. And where culturally recognized precepts of rights give both sides good moral arguments, there is a moral stalemate in which both sides are rhetorically armed with good reasons for declaring the other evil. It is at this point that force becomes the final arbiter. The second argument he makes, drawing from Karl Marx, is that the stubborn persistence of poverty, the instability of capitalist systems, and the exploitation of labor are all consistent with recognizing the rights of humanity, but embodied in the law of commerce. Where everything is sold at market price in a free market with property rights respected, it is often the case that labor is sold for little or nothing. This is a norm which is also endorsed by the same societies that harp on human rights. The third argument drawn from Solzhenitsyn and Gandhi is that in principles, right without duties are unworkable. Like liberty, rights talk can easily lend itself to an irresponsible ethic. It authorizes anyone to say what they are supposed to be allowed to do, allowed to have, supposed to get, and so on. But it does not make anyone responsible for contributing to the welfare of others or to the common good. It is at this point, he points us to the need to go an extra step to take seriously the need to work towards a culture of peace. According to Galton, direct violence kills quickly or maims. its victims are numbered through body counts. But violence is structural when force is not exerted willfully by a person, but by a structure created and perpetuated by a custom or law. It kills slowly. Cultural violence highlights the way in which the act of direct violence and the fact of structural violence are legitimized and thus rendered acceptable in society. One way in which cultural violence works is by changing the moral color of an act from wrong to right or to some other intermediate meaning palatable to the status quo. Another way it works is by making reality opaque so that we do not see the violent acts or fact, or when we see it not as violent. But by making reality opaque, the cultural violence prevents consciousness formation. So, in my conclusion, I can say that it is performing peaceful acts which, when repeated, becomes peaceful practices and gives rise to peaceful traditions. To work for peace is therefore to work against these three types of violence. The universities should analyze the oncoming of the three forms of violence before they strike, and causes, and help the nation in predicting in order to prevent. And if done properly, we act preventively and curatively. Peace, like war, is a disposition or a set of dispositions and acts of human will, a conscious activity. Education for a culture of peace would infuse the living and coming generation with a profound aversion against violence. It is also it also means understanding conflict as part of human existence and learning the skills for transformation of those conflicts without resulting to violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Odora Hoppers, for the lively presentation. Yes, indeed, you tease out a quite very important aspect that I do believe that, we're able to zoom back into those kind of issues that you raise. Quite very important. You touch on issues that really, in our view, are at the center of what really is a challenge that we see much more in our democracies, in terms of what should be the role of, universities in ensuring that, this democracy is well being endowed even to the society, and how this process of legitimization, violence, becomes so common in our societies and this and that. So these are the things that are, in my view, quite very important. And I do hope that, we'll come back to some of these issues, just to see how we are able to really weave them into the discussion for us to move forward in that. Let me not take much time now and just introduce our second speaker, Professor Rajesh Tandon. Professor Rajesh Tandon is an internationally acclaimed leader and practitioner of participatory research and development. He is the founder president of Participatory Research in Asia, a global center for participatory research and training since 1982 in India, New Delhi. Professor Tandon is also a co-chair of the UNESCO Chair on Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education. Quite again, very important in the role that he plays around social responsibility, also with the topic that is under discussion here. With that few words, let me hand over to Professor Rajesh Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much. And thank you, colleagues, for inviting me to engage in this conference on engaged universities in South Africa, engaged universities around the world. And my task has been made much easier because Professor Hopper set a macro perspective, which is multidimensional. And let me therefore focus attention on universities because she has set a wonderful context. I speak from largely my experience in the largest political democracy in the world, electoral democracy in the world. We have nearly 800 million voters these days in our country. And we have 3 tiers of governance: local government, provincial government, and national government, for which elections are held periodically. The voting age is now 18. Above the age of 18, every young person can automatically get registered with some effort and cast his or her vote in all these elections. 18 is also about the time when young people begin to enter post-secondary institutions, colleges, polytechnics, universities, medical schools, law colleges, engineering colleges, schools of architecture, planning, you name it. And as you are perhaps aware, India is the 3rd largest in sheer numbers, 3rd largest higher education, post-secondary education provider institution. We have 40,000 plus colleges, post-secondary colleges. We have nearly 1,000 public universities, and we have another 4,000 private and professional institutions in private domain. And we have approximately 45 million young people enrolled in post-secondary education. In the last 2 decades, particularly, the expansion of the post-secondary education system, enrollment, as well as inclusion, particularly through affirmative action provisions, it is quite a widespread, quite checkered sort of a higher education system. Of course, the system has been under lockdown in the last 18 months since the pandemic, and different stages of opening up, if at all. But let me tell you what I did when I was growing up and going to college. So I went to an engineering institute first, then to a management school. And what I learned, other than engineering curriculum in my engineering institute, is the practice of democracy in everyday life. How did it happen? I grew up in a smaller town where English was not my mother tongue. I studied English as a subject, but not spoken. When I went to the engineering college, Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, through a competitive selection process, there were 300 plus other students in my first year batch, and of course, around 2,000 total number of students on campus. Beautiful campus, lovely hostels and facilities, labs, everything, library, great place. But it took 2 years for me to feel a degree of comfort in relating to other students. And by the way, they were mostly men at that time, who came from different regions, different language groups, different cultural, religious, ethnic, different food habits. And that experience was very stimulating, occasionally scary, but I learned to speak in English. I was good at writing English and reading English, but I didn't speak a word of English before I came there. And half my batchmates were fluent in English because they came out of Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, Bangalore, or wherever they came from. Now, why is this important? Because in our context, up to high school, more or less, you meet young people of your own type. Most high schools are within the district or within the city you grew up, and you meet people more or less of the same type. Same language group, same cultural habits. Of course, there is a difference of socio-economic status and all that, but you don't meet outright different others. And it's only when you go to post-secondary, post-high school institution, whether it's a polytechnic or a college or a university or a professional school, that you confront diversity. You come face to face in your classroom, in your hostel, on the campus, in the library, in the computer lab, wherever you go, you meet people who look different, speak different, smell different, dress different. So what do? When I was growing up, and till date, our universities or colleges never taught us anything about our constitutional preamble. We have a great constitution, which was adopted in 1950, now 71 years. The preamble of the constitution talks about foundational values of freedom, of equality, of justice, of fraternity, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of religion, equality of opportunity, equality of access, justice, social, economic, cultural, and fraternity, to live together with peace, in harmony. Now, this preamble is fantastic, but its meaning was never taught to us when we were in colleges, still not taught. Of course, we learn a lesson in civics, which tells you how the system of government is structured, but that's not what values are all about. So at the age of 18, when a young person enters college, that young person becomes a voter. And for that young person, exercising democratic right gets narrowly defined as a voting right. And what electoral democracy throws up as options, Professor Hopper has very beautifully explained. Elites with means. It's not contesting ideologies, contesting elites with means. That's what it is. So, is the purpose of higher education, therefore, the purpose of universities, only to produce a skilled labor force which can migrate to Silicon Valley? Or is the purpose of higher education also to inculcate the values of active citizenship? Citizenship is not a course in civics. It's not a curriculum. It's not a 2-credit course. Citizenship is practice in everyday life. The space that universities offer can be utilized to encourage conversations, debates, and discussions with different others. with others with different perspectives, points of view, and theories. And while this debate is being carried on the campuses, in the space that higher education offers, it also teaches young people how to listen with respect to a point of view entirely different from yours, and how to practice reaching a decision despite differences. The practice of democracy in everyday life is not casting a vote to elect a government. The practice of democracy in everyday life is to learn to become active citizens who demonstrate the foundational values in the preamble of our Constitution: freedom, equality, justice, fraternity. And universities, unfortunately, in recent years have begun to recede from this space. In the last 20-25 years, as major international agencies like the World Bank began to tell us that higher education is a private good, people should pay for it because they benefit from it, that unfortunate perspective has infiltrated all our national governments and all our higher education systems. We look at higher education as factories for producing qualified, skilled labor force. That was not the way it used to be in earlier period. And that is not how it ought to be. Higher education's public purpose, societal relevance, social responsibility is at the core of the very idea of education at this level. The meaning of higher is not in terms of how high the building of the university is. The meaning of higher is how high the practice of citizenship and societal responsibility is imbibed in the course of that. This requires that teaching and research in university system enables critical yet open minds to question, to innovate, but only after they have learned how to respectfully listen to others. Listen to those who are in the communities. Out of a country of 1.3 billion, only 45 million are in the universities in India. Listen to those who are not able to enter higher education, but have valuable point of view and knowledge to share. Do we enable our young people in universities to learn that? Does our pedagogy take them to the field in order to respectfully understand what the society has contributed to their own learning? And these questions have become particularly relevant as we come out of, hopefully soon, from this long COVID pandemic. Because the pandemic has forced our young people to re-examine questions of lifestyle and its contribution to sustainability. Higher education institutions must open up the space for conversations about what curriculum is being taught to engineers and economists and managers and architects, which has led to serious climate disaster and impact around the world, and how that curriculum therefore should be dramatically altered. How the space in the university campus, in the classroom, among teachers and students should enable open conversation about how the holy cow and receive wisdom of economics, global supply chains, produce for economies of scale, how all those theories have been busted, completely busted by the pandemic. You couldn't buy or move food from anywhere other than in your neighborhood. And only those societies and those communities were able to feed themselves, which were locally self-reliant. Even supply of computer chips from China, Taiwan, and Korea was disrupted. So how can universities create a public space, a civic space for these conversations to happen? Not only among those who are inside the university, students, faculty, and other staff, or alumni, but also those who are outside, with political leaders, with community leaders, with business leaders, with civic leaders, with religious leaders. How can that conversation be enabled? And my submission is that this public space that universities offer is unfortunately being diminished. It is receding. And for a large part, one can always blame political leaders. It's easy to blame political leaders. But why is it happening in large electoral democracies like South Africa and India? I can understand it is happening in China, or it is happening in, some other situation, Saudi Arabia or wherever. But if we pride ourselves to be electoral democracies, and if we want to nurture and expand the scope of those systems of electoral democracy, then the choice is not between voting one elite versus another elite. The actual choice is to have conversations about practice of democracy in everyday life, in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and learning that in our high schools, universities, and colleges. And I feel that the leadership of universities must reclaim that space and not allow it to be reduced, curtailed, or impinged upon by either private interest for profit or political partisan interest to expand the voter constituency. The young people on university campus are not voters. They are voters incidentally. Primarily, they are citizens. And for them to understand and exercise their rights and duties as citizens within the society, not vis-a-vis the government, is far more critical at this juncture. If we have to renew our societies, our perspectives on development, our professional expertise in order to build a new model of well-being and social harmony and development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tandon. Indeed, quite a very thought-provoking perspective that you tease out from your presentation. Just, of course, building also on top of what has been raised by Professor Odora Hoppers, the sense of reimagining higher education. You also made a note of around, higher education as for public good, which is something that sort of run across your theme, and the role that is to be played by the university leadership in ensuring that we are able to inculcate the values of active citizenship amongst the students. So quite a very important aspect that you raised in your presentation, and I just hope that we'll have some time just also to reflect on some of these. Colleagues, I'm now going to introduce our third and the last speaker of this session, is Professor Nomalanga Mkhize. Professor Mkhize is the historian, and she's based at the Nelson Mandela University in Quebec. in the Eastern Cape province. Prof. Mkhize is currently the acting director for the School of Governmental and Social Sciences. She's a strong advocate for the early mother tongue reading and has collaborated in developing books and materials in African languages for children. Professor Mkhize's research interests are in African language, historical literatures, vernacular in histography, and also the 19th century Eastern Cape history. With that brief introduction, let me hand over to Professor Mkhize. Over to you, ma'am.
Thanks so much, colleague. And thank you also to the two colleagues who have presented and laid such a strong foundation for me to present on. The theme of the conference is the engaged university. But of course, the sub-theme we are dealing with is basically the question of democracy and universities. I really appreciate the two prior colleagues really getting to the heart of the fact that the concept of democracy or the practice of democracy is one which goes beyond the state. And that requires that we think deeply about the university and its particular role and the way that the universities themselves have been, sort of developing in this era of sort of neoliberal dominance. I've titled my presentation, Rerouting the Center. So I think we are all going through quite a lot of interrogation of how to manage how to think rather, conceptualize these universities that we have inherited, that we are dealing with right now. And it's something that can sometimes lead you to feel, when you see the structural problems and the structural crises that we're dealing with across the globe, especially in the global south, you just think, what hope is there for us? So this is a way for me to think about the issue of how to take what is crisis and actually see it as a way that the crisis is making us rethink what should be the center of knowledge, the center of the university in the world at large. So rerouting the center is the way I'm framing it. Now we know that the concept of engagement or the engaged university is one which has emerged in many ways as we've shifted away from the idea that the university is a separate part of society. That's been challenged quite strongly over the past 30 or so years or 40 years even. So we've shifted away from this ivory tower sort of approach to the university. And we see the university as not necessarily a space that should be understood as having to be protected from society itself, because we are embedded in society. And there's been a critique, especially from the left, globally, internationally, and within the anti-colonial struggles, that says that that grand idea of the university, the liberal idea of the university, is inadequate given the way in which we have experienced the university in our parts of the world, or the modern university that is. And so the left has seen the university as a social institution that ought to promote some kind of social change. And so in that sense, the university is seen as having to address the problems of democracy, the problems of inequality that we face in the global south. Of course, there has been some infiltration by the discourse of corporate social responsibility into the idea of the engaged university. And that does have a lot of impact into how engagement itself is shaped. But broadly, I think we can agree that in our context, it's the tradition of anti-colonialism and struggle that has led this discussion around the fact that the university has to be some kind of agent of social change, that it has to make a meaningful contribution to the social order. Of course, we know that prior to democracy in South Africa, there were differences in the cultures of freedom, engagement, and dissent across the system in the South African university system. Of course, at large, the South African higher education system under apartheid was one which really facilitated the operation of people. So the universities that we've inherited in South Africa have much longer cultures of being undemocratic than of being democratic. Now, of course, the historically Black universities, the Bantustan universities, and some of the more English liberal institutions produced within themselves cultures and identities of democratic engagement, anti-apartheid humanism, liberatory intellectual engagement that sort of became part of our broader intellectual traditions in this country. There we can speak to the role of the University of Natal, the University of Limpopo, the University of Fort Hare, the University of the Western Cape, and so forth, right? And then to some degree, the University of Cape Town and others, where even though they were white and really the institutions supported the state itself, there were within them people who could dissent. Now, the former Afrikaner universities are somewhat different because they were almost created to become support structures of the grand project of sort of regressive nationalism. Now, post-apartheid, we all know what has gone down. I think we could argue that we have generally failed to take the cultures of engagement and struggle and dissent that were formed in those universities under apartheid. We've kind of failed to really infuse them into the current climate that we live in. And I think this is largely because of the overwhelming forces of commercialization that have been spoken about, bureaucratization, neoliberalization, everything has really contended with these amazing cultures of liberatory thought that came with struggle. And of course, the inequality and the massification of higher education in South Africa has created quite a difficult climate in which to really think innovatively because of the kinds of struggles that we face. And we know that we didn't really succeed in really infusing those liberatory cultures as authentically as they were passed down to us, because there were student protests in 2015 and 2016 that basically spoke to this. And although those student protests were not only about the past and the struggles of the struggle of the universities to handle the politics of liberation, I think at the core of them was this feeling that there's a gap somewhere in the South African university system. Of course, there have been some qualitative transformational shifts in the South African system. That's not to say nothing has happened. And I just always like to highlight the work of the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences as one example of how the tradition of liberation led to the kinds of engagements within our system between academics, the state, other stakeholders to produce an agent in the form of the NIHSS that almost embodies that kind of thinking that we were handed down in our liberatory struggles. And so there have been all these changes that have happened here and there, but I think the fact that 2015 and 2016 happened means that we can all accept that there has been a major shortcoming. I think I won't read this Wolpe quote, but I think what Harold Wolpe noted in 1997 has pretty much not changed now. I put it here just to remind myself that, when Harold Wolpe looked at the higher education system then and the struggles that UWC was having to transform itself into a new sort of, into the new era, that there were all these structural issues that sort of came into play and really constrained what was a university that people, I think, had really high hopes for in terms of its history as a center of intellectual struggle and activism, that I think there was a hope that it would become this radically different type of institution in the new South Africa. And there were all these constraints that really forced that vision to be curtailed. And so the fact that what we see then is that in post-apartheid South Africa, the same cleavages and inequality that were built into the system under white rule continue today, but in slightly different forms. And we note, for example, that a lot of the historically white universities carry the research accolades, they carry the research capacity, they carry the research capability, and in a way form still a kind of an epistemic center and almost like a stabilization center for the system, whilst the historically Black universities and some of the newer formulations of the universities that we have developed since the end of apartheid, these universities tend to struggle. I just thought I should put this map here because, when you look at the ranking system, when you look at the universities that are ranked highly, I mean, there's, sometimes you'll see, the Northwest and Free State and my own university, Mandela University, sort of popping up here and there. But by and large, the center of our innovation, of our research and production system is really at where the economic centers are, which is Gauteng and the Western Cape. And that's where you see just the spatial entrenchment of inequality within the higher education system. So there's really just these two centers. And it's often argued that, when student protest breaks out in South Africa, if it breaks out at the center, that is where the attention will largely be paid. But if protest breaks out anywhere else on the margins, there'll be some media attention, but those protests will not be seen to be making a major contribution to the overall questions about the structural problems. They'll be seen as localized, phenomena, these student protests, unless they happen somewhere, in the center institutions. Now, I think, I was listening so closely to the other colleagues, and I just thought it's such a beautiful framework for where I'm trying to think through these issues. And one of the things that I've realized that on the one hand, we have the system that tends to have centers of gravity that are so powerful, they're so functional and so strong, these centers sort of universities, and so capable of producing, and contending when there's a vaccine, it's going to go to this university, they're going to be the ones that are contributing to the vaccine research. When there's rankings, which one's going to come up at the top. And, I thought about that and I thought, but that's wonderful. That's great for South Africa in the sense that we like to be seen to be global player. But there are some pitfalls to that, because while South Africa seems to want to come out at the global rankings, we're still on the margins of the globe itself. So our universities are fantastic. The ones at the center, the strong ones, the research intensive universities, the vice-chancellors were arguing they needed more funding than the rest of us and so forth. But they really are powerful in the ways that they are powerful. So now I'm talking systemically. There's a lot of institutional nationalism in South Africa. We all tend to be patriotic to the university that we work in. So just to all the vice-chancellors watching here, this is about the system. It's not about any particular university. And it's talking about the ecosystem and the ways in which we are going to have to watch for the system as a whole. When you're at the center, there are some problems that can beset you. One of those in South Africa has been that contestations over transformation that happen at the center, as far as I can see, people can contest me, but they are becoming far more polarized at the center and far more difficult and far more contentious in many ways to resolve than those at the margins. Because at the margins, they tend to be so many other problems as well, other than transformation that and the systems tend to be pushing to sort of resolve the issue of transformation at the margin in a way that actually needs to address the social problems that students face in a much more in a way that says that we have problems. Yes, there's transformation, but we also have other problems. So in order to solve transformation, we have to solve other problems as well. It's a contentious point I'm making. There's a feeling that I have that at the center, the question of transformation remains central in a way that seems irresolvable sometimes. Also at the center, we find that if there's an all, we are excellent, there is an all is well understanding of these institutions. Often the contestations around those institutions seem to belie that all is well or all is going to be well because we're so excellent. So I think, I think there is sometimes a tendency between the identity of the institution versus its reality to sort of, there's sort of a gap between the the dominant institution and its identity of itself versus the actual reality of what's unfolding because of the South African social crisis itself. So my provocation to colleagues is this, is that I think that if you're in a highly ranked institution, you may be doing well for your branding and your PR, but you may also find that it's the extensive integration into these global epistemic paradigms that's awarding you your high ranking, which means that far from being ranked highly because you are innovative, you're ranked highly because you're following orthodoxy. And in fact, that probably means that that's why we find that South Africa is struggling to innovate, because the integration into these global systems of reward and recognition means that as a South African higher education sector, we may actually be following the trends rather than finding a way to think outside of the trends. It means that I think, especially in the humanities, that when we are forcing our way in trying to keep our productivity high so that the global north and the global centers recognize us, what may happen, in fact, is that we are moving towards some kind of monoculture of thinking, which again speaks to the innovation being slower than what we may realize. And also anything that we choose to dissent, we may find ourselves punished because of how integrated one can be at the center to the global orthodoxies. And in that sense, I do want to point out that there's often this game that we play in the global south, in the humanities especially, where we engage in pseudo-dissent, especially around questions of race. So you find this performative dissent and performative radicalism that comes from the global south, that says, we are here to critique the global north and tell the global north that its dominance is over. And yet we know for sure that that's not what's happening. The real game we're playing is to try and actually make sure that if we were to try and get a job at Harvard, we could get a job at Harvard. If we needed to migrate and get a job at Oxford, we'd want that job at Oxford. So we play this game of pseudo-dissent that just sort of differentiates us somewhat, but actually incorporates us into these ideological consensus of the global north. So this now, just in terms of my, I'm watching my time, Prof. Just in terms of the rerouting question, my argument is that we should actually reroute the whole thought about the system and think of the center as being more vulnerable than the margins, where the margins are often seen as vulnerable because we are dysfunctional, we are parochial, the margins have these problems and often are mimicking in bad ways what's happening at the center. I would argue that the resilience in the system will be built from the margins. And this is because I think when you're on the margins, you tend to be left alone to become very contextual in your focus. You tend to have niche competence. You're left to your own devices. You're free from the hegemonic games. You tend to be undisciplined, which can be good or bad. But if our lack of discipline at the margins tends to meet rigor, then we can see innovation emerge. And it takes courage to then take on the global center using these contextual abilities and niche competencies to allow us to actually produce the kind of academics and graduates that are socially intelligent enough to be masters of the margin, contenders to the center, but also contribute to the global. So I'll leave it there because I think the chair is chasing my tail there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Mkhize, for a very thought-provoking presentation. You know, indeed, you sort of narrowed it in terms of, you know, the context in the country, while the two previous speakers much more spoke in terms of, you know, the world as we know it, you know. So you sort of brought in quite very closely to home, and I really want to thank you for that, you know. There was just one question that I thought it came through the chat, if that question can be read quickly. I think it was for Professor Odora Hoppers. If I can ask Mr. Fish, if you can maybe just assist me on that. And then we quickly close because we are just over the time.
Yes, it was a question from Dr. Buerta saying, how does one ameliorate perceptions and practices of violence as a means to an end in our university context?
Yeah, can I just request maybe within a minute, Prof, if you can just quickly respond to the question?
Okay, just briefly, this cross-cutting transdisciplinary fields that are emerging, for example, IKS, gender, peace, conflict management, should be at the crux of the new academy because they answer directly to what society needs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. I just say, while I conclude, there's also just something that I thought I need to check with Professor Tandon. In terms of how you put it, the role that is to be played by the university leadership. Because of course, normally there's a blame game where you said, it has to be done somewhere. But you put it in quite a very eloquent way, the role that is to be played by the university leadership. And also in that light, just maybe for Professor Mkhize, you talk about this monoculture of thought that really defines what you sort of presented, just for me, for the panel also, just to maybe also zoom into that, because we seem to celebrate, when we talk transformation, normally we revert back to what we know, which is not much about transformation. Maybe just on that also for yourself. Let me give Professor Tandon just under 1 minute also. We seem to have lost Professor Tandon, but I can, if Professor Mkhize, if you had my question, you can just maybe zoom into that.
No, very quickly, it's just to say that if we are only concerned about the strongest universities, then all of us will tend to want to think like everyone in them. And that's not good for the system. So we have to look at even the weaker universities and accept that they have a contribution to make to diversifying knowledge.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, colleagues, and allow me to thank all the presenters. Indeed, quite a very thought-provoking presentations that each of them made. I need to thank them for how they even handled their presentations. I'm going to hand over now to the Secretariat. And from my side, let me thank you, colleagues, and also the audience for joining this session. Thank you.